The Midnight Ferry. Written and narrated by Creepy Oz. There are very few hard and fast rules at play in this universe. Certainly, fewer than we would like to believe. Sure, we have built ourselves a comfortable little modern society under the false pretense that we are ever truly in control of any of it. Overly confident in the knowledge that nothing which exists outside of our realms of understanding can ever really harm us. Well, I've had an experience which suggests otherwise recently. One that I will recount to you. A lot of it, I'm still processing, still mentally working through. As such, I will not come at this retelling all at once, but rather, one step at a time. I feel it important, not only for my own mental well-being, but for your awareness, that I ensure no detail is missed. I know it sounds cliche, but there really is something of a lesson in all of this. At least I think there is. This all started a little over a week ago, on a hot summer's night in Sydney City. Late was the hour as I finally shuffled my way out of the office, capping off yet another entirely monotonous work week. This was not out of the ordinary, of course. A corporate career in Sydney's CBD may seem like a dream for some, and it probably is for the corporate overlords on the top floors. But the reality for most of us shit kickers is long hours that our pay packets rarely match. This night, I had been lucky enough to only give up 2 hours and 15 minutes of my own time. I had long since learned to consider this the norm and not complain. So without another thought, I made my way out to the elevator and hit the call button. A resounding ding signaled its arrival to the 7th floor, and I stepped on in before swiftly pressing the button for ground. I wanted out of this dreary old building. It had been a long week, and I was keen to head on over to the Helm Bar for a few cold ones before making my way home for the night. Once again, another ding from the elevator's digital display, and I stepped on out. I gave a quick nod of acknowledgement to Barry, the night guard, before scanning my keycard and opening the door to a blast of hot, humid air. And so concluded the last day of normality I would ever know. As planned, I strolled on over to the Helm Bar, one of my favourite spots, always a good place for happy hour. I ordered myself a drink, grabbed a booth, and I just sat back and looked out over the harbour. The water is beautifully calm this time of night, with not a great number of vessels still operating. Sipping my beer, I raised an eyebrow as I noted something strange. A fog. That was certainly not usual this time of year. And yet, there it was. A clearly defined fog settling in over Darling Harbour. I continued to watch it over the next hour or so I was there, as it steadily grew denser, continuing to expand up and down the surface of the water. At this point though, I would have been prepared to put it down to the effect of one too many schooners I'd been knocking back. The barkeep's cry of "last call" finally got me thinking it may be time to make a move and get back home. I gave a quick wave across the bar, signaling my departure, before heading downstairs and making my way back up to the docks to catch the ferry back home. I decided I'd walk along the water this time. The steady breeze across the harbour was a nice break from the insufferable heat. As I strolled, I couldn't help but notice that fog again. It had grown thicker still, and I wondered if the ferries would even still be running with this lack of visibility. I stepped up my pace a bit, breaking into a jog and running down the ramp at the Barangaroo docks. I didn't want to miss out on potentially the last ride home. Thankfully, there it was, just pulling in as I made my way down the ramp, swiping my card at the gates. I waited for the departing passengers to make their way off before stepping on board and taking a seat inside. Looking out the portside window, I watched as the crew pulled back the ramp and latched the gates before the ferry pulled away from the dock and made its way out onto the harbour. As it did so, I realised something. I had majorly goofed. This ferry was going the wrong way. Damn it, I thought. I would either have to sit on board now for the long trip up and down the Parramatta River, or get off at the next stop and change. I chose the latter option. It would be hours before I got home otherwise. In hindsight, that would have been preferable. I got up from my seat, making my way out into the open air, glancing out across the dark waters as the lights of the ferry cut through the thick, foggy night air. We could barely see 10 meters or so ahead, and I honestly wondered how safe this actually was. The thought of crashing head-on into another ship in the middle of the harbour was a harrowing thought, and as I gazed down into the black, foggy depths, I shuddered just to think of it. That had always been a fear of mine, the idea of deep water. I was fine on boats, strangely enough, but when it comes to actually swimming in water like that, that's a whole other story. Not even touching on the bull sharks present in the harbour, just the fact that you're floating above what is essentially a giant hole in the ground, if not for the liquid keeping you suspended above it. Thalassophobia, they call it, and I had been cursed with it from a young age. I still recall the first time I watched Jaws, that scene with the girl's legs dangling haplessly in the water. That gave me nightmares for weeks on end. I breathed a sigh of relief as 2 blasts from the ferry's horn rang out through the night, and we began to dock at Balmain East. With a loud clang, the ramp was wheeled out, and I quickly made my way off the boat. What a monumental screw-up this had been. I would be waiting at least another half hour for the return trip, and I still needed to change services before I could make my way back home. At this rate, it was going to be long past midnight before I finally made it back. On the bright side, it was a weekend, so at least I could have a sleep in tomorrow. I took a seat on a small wooden bench that looked like it probably should have been replaced years ago, and I waited for the next ferry to come along. I sighed, checking my watch and noticing the time was ticking ever closer to midnight. I paused for a moment. I actually wasn't sure if the ferries even ran after midnight. I glanced up and down the harbour, getting a little worried now. I couldn't see anything, just fog. I turned my head and I listened carefully for any signs of an approaching vessel, but no luck. All I could hear was the soft lapping of the water against the docks. I sat there for a little while longer, feeling more and more uneasy as yet more time ticked by, with not a single indication that any return ferry was coming my way. I stood up, ready to try my luck with Uber or a cab. I pulled out my phone, noting the clock reading 11:58 p.m, and I prepared to open the Uber app. When, what do you know, along came my ferry. Thank goodness, I thought to myself. That would have been a very expensive ride home, especially at this hour. Scanning my card for the second time that night, I climbed on board, and I once again grabbed a seat inside the air-conditioned cabin. I rested my head against the glass window and I watched outside, taking in the sights of the distant city lights beyond the foggy harbour. I could have dozed off right there and then, to be honest, and I may have, were it not for the almighty bang that startled me out of my relaxed state. The ferry gates had been absolutely slammed shut with a force well beyond necessary. This guy must be having a bad night, I thought, and I made a mental note to stay clear of him. I sat back in my seat once again, and I continued to gaze out the window as the ferry's engine powered up and we were out on the open water again. This time, in the right direction. A resounding blast from the ferry's horn woke me from an unintentional nap. Damn it, had I missed my stop? Wiping my bleary eyes, I stretched and I took a look around. The first thing I noticed was the fog. It was beginning to clear a bit, but it was still hard to see outside. The second thing I noticed was a fellow passenger. I don't know how long I was asleep, but I'm sure I would have heard if we stopped. I took a glance out of my peripheral vision. I'm sure this guy was not here before. I suppose he may have come down from upstairs or something, but that wasn't the weirdest part. No. What was weird was his seemingly undivided attention squarely on me. There was no mistaking it. He was staring intently right at me. I tried hard to ignore him, to look out the window, but even then, I could see clearly his wide eyes in the reflection. He was giving me the creeps. I decided to get up and get some fresh air. Primarily, I just wanted to get away from him, to avoid a confrontation with what looked to be a person strung out on some kind of substance. That wasn't entirely uncommon in the city, especially at late hours. I quietly slid out of my row of seats and I made a beeline for the rear doors, sliding them open and stepping out on deck into the fresh air. It took me a minute to comprehend what I was feeling, as it was so far outside the realms of normal. The air was freezing cold. Bear in mind, this is smack in the middle of an Australian summer. Just moments before, the air had been miserably hot. Another blast from the ferry's horn rang out in the now bitter cold night. Then suddenly, the ferry jerked a bit from side to side. I grabbed a hold of the railing as I walked around to the front of the vessel. The lights carved a path through the fog, and I could see that we were pulling into Milson's Point. Glancing down at my watch now, I froze in disbelief. It was now 2 a.m. in the morning. That was not possible. For one thing, this stop should be a 5-minute ride at most from Balmain East. And secondly, this ferry route definitely did not run this late. In fact, when I really thought about it, I was surprised there was even a ferry coming back this way in the first place. I couldn't quite recall, as I wasn't usually out that late, but I really didn't think they ran past midnight. Not as far as I knew. As for one running back and forth across the harbour at 2 a.m, no way. There never has been. Likely never will be. I jolted back as the ferry came to an abrupt stop. Oh my god, we had hit something. I knew it. My anxiety kicked into full gear as I glanced around for the nearest life jacket. Merely seconds later, however, an announcement came over the PA.
Please relax. We are simply adjusting our heading. Return to your seat, please.
I slowly made my way back inside, my heart still racing. I decided to take a seat up front this time, so I could keep an eye on what was going on. I caught sight of that weirdo again, on my way past, and there was no mistake. He was staring right into my damn soul. What really frightened me, though, was not just the fact that he was staring, but the look in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was concern. He genuinely looked like he was troubled to see me there. He finally looked away as I passed him by and shot him a stare right back, letting him know that he had long since crossed my boundaries. He didn't look annoyed or offended in any way, though. He just looked down at his feet, sheepishly. Honestly, that gave me more of a chill than if he'd gotten out of his seat and started throwing fists. I continued on up to the front of the ferry, and I took my seat right next to the window facing out over the bow. There I sat and waited and watched. Onwards we sailed, past the Sydney Harbour Bridge, past the Opera House, and I almost breathed a sigh of relief as we made the turn, heading back out to my final stop. But here's the thing. We didn't stop. Instead of continuing on around the bend to Manly Beach, the ferry took a hard right, sailing out beyond the boundaries of the harbour, sailing out into open waters. The fog began to thicken once again, and the frosty air of the night started to seep its way inside the cabin. The ferry was rocking back and forth more violently now as we disappeared into the open ocean, away from the safety of the harbour lights, away from the calm waters within it. My stomach dropped as I felt the boat lift up and over one of the many looming dark waves outside, before coming crashing down again. It was, of course, at this point, I knew something was very wrong. Lifting my watch up again, I noted the time. 3 a.m. Another hour had passed since we had drifted away from Milson's Point. My head began to spin as I wondered as to the possibilities. Had this ferry been hijacked? I ran up the stairs and I bashed on the captain's door. I screamed and I shouted, trying to get someone's attention. But no response came. There was nothing more I could do. Defeated, I staggered my way to the back of the vessel, my legs like jelly now, and I collapsed to the floor. I just stared outside. My line of sight from here, a straight shot out through the upper rear doors. Darkness. That was all I could see. There was not even any sign of the vibrant city lights anymore. We were far beyond where any city ferry should be sailing. We were slowly disappearing, further and further into the darkness of the South Pacific. So there I laid, and there I watched as the hours slowly ticked by. Eventually, my eyes could remain suspended no longer, and sleep finally took me. It was a rather slow realization as I awoke to a new day. The crushing truth that none of this had been a dream slowly dawning on me as I awoke to the sound of waves lashing against the upper floor windows. It was then that my sleepy state rapidly subsided, and I recalled every awful detail of the previous night. With the effects of last night's alcohol consumption largely wearing off by this stage, things began to come back to me. The first notable image which ran through my mind with renewed clarity was the arrival of this mysterious ferry at Balmain East, near on midnight. It was clear to me now, there were definitely not supposed to be any ferries running back this way at that time. And furthermore, something about the vessel, it didn't look right. The ferries of Sydney Harbour, they have a distinct green and yellow look to them. I suppose I may have passed it off at the time, as it was dark and foggy, and I was more interested in getting home than anything. But I did recall now being slightly taken aback at the time by the unique dark grey colouring of this vessel. I sat myself up, rubbing my eyes, intending to head outside and confirm my hazy memory, when I heard a crackle from above me.
Greetings, passengers. The cafe service is now open. Please proceed to the counter in an orderly fashion, and you will be served momentarily.
Interesting, I thought. I might actually get to speak to someone. Maybe find out what the hell is going on. I glanced around, and yes, there was indeed a man behind the counter at the cafe. He was a rather tall individual, bald, and he wore a grey suit. Strange attire for a cafe worker on a commuter ferry, I thought. But then again, look where we were. I gathered myself before standing up and making my way over to the cafe. There were 2 passengers ahead of me, so I stood back and waited my turn. Their behaviour seemed ever so slightly off to me, and I was reminded of that strange man last night. They were acting very similar to him, standing there nervously, shifting their weight from side to side, heads down, staring at their feet. The first man made his way up to the counter and quietly mumbled something to the attendant before stepping back and waiting for his order. The tall man behind the counter smiled softly before turning around and reaching into the freezer compartment, pulling out a Mrs. Mack's sausage roll and throwing it into the microwave. He then returned to the counter as the second customer stepped up, placing an order for a coffee and a slice of carrot cake. Cafe guy gave me a weird vibe. He was simultaneously the kindest man I had ever laid eyes on, smiling the sweetest of smiles as he served the customers their orders. And yet, there was something ominous about his demeanour, as though secrets were hiding behind those kind eyes. Secrets I wanted in on. I snapped myself back to the present moment as I noticed he was staring at me, and I stepped up to the counter. His expression changed as he got a good look at me. That kind smile replaced with a look of concern and a hint of amusement. He mused.
Interesting.
I raised an eyebrow at this, curious to know what he found so interesting about me. Excuse me, but what's interesting? I asked him, not bothering to beat around the bush. He just stared back at me for a moment before shaking his head.
Oh, sorry, sir. Never mind me. It's a bit too early in the morning, I suppose. What can I get for you today?
I glanced around behind me, and seeing no more customers waiting in line, I decided that now was a good time to press for answers. I leaned in, lowering my voice to an almost whisper. Can you tell me what's going on. I got on this ferry late last night, and before I knew what was going on, we were headed out to sea. Is this normal? Is there a new route I don't know about? And what's with the captain? He didn't answer when I knocked on the door and called out. Cafe guy breathed in slowly before letting out a sigh, and I stepped back, sensing a little annoyance on his part. I quickly relaxed though, as that kind smile returned.
Sir, this is the same route this service has always taken. This is the same route it will always take. There's no need to worry. You'll be home soon. Now, what can I get for you?
I just stared at him, a mix of curiosity and concern present on my face, I'm sure. But I decided to place a molecule of faith in his words. He seemed confident that I would be on my way back home soon enough. Don't get me wrong, even in that moment, I was still acutely aware that something was very wrong with this ferry. But it's amazing how far the rational side of the brain can stretch when it wants to. With a sigh, I spoke up. Just a coffee, thanks, mate. Latte, 2 shots. Cafe guy nodded.
Coming right up, sir.
I waited patiently as he prepared my coffee, humming Kumbaya to himself as he did so. He was an odd fellow, with a personality that did not seem to match his face. With a hiss of the coffee machine, steam pouring out of the vents, my coffee was ready, and he handed it to me with that same warm smile, never wavering. I nodded to him before turning and walking back towards the rear doors, eager to get some caffeine into my system. Sliding open the rear doors, I stepped out onto the upper deck, walking over to the railings and resting against them as I stared out over the infinite blue expanse before me. Yeah, definitely wasn't a dream, I thought. There was no sign of land in any direction. I noticed how strangely quiet it was, and I then realized the ferry's engine wasn't running. We were just kind of bobbing up and down there in the water. The waves, a little calmer now, lapping up against the side of the boat. I gripped the railing a bit tighter as I noted the absence of seagull calls, realizing that we must be very, very far out to sea. I felt a chill come over me as I imagined the expansive black hole beneath the ferry, the only protection from being swallowed up by it being this rickety bucket of bolts I was standing on. My grip on the railing tightened a bit further as the ship subtly rocked from side to side. I sipped my coffee, trying my best to distract myself from those thoughts, and I pondered what might lay ahead for me. My mind was still plagued by the possibilities as to what could be going on, still not satisfied that a hijacking was out of the question. Would we soon be approached by pirate vessels? Would we simply explode at any moment, leaving any survivors to the fate of the Pacific Ocean? No, that didn't make sense. There weren't enough of us on board to make any kind of terroristic political statement worthwhile. There was something more to this. I didn't know what, but with every passing second, the hope of actually getting home was becoming more and more of a distant pipe dream. An enormous blast from the ferry's blower, and the engine roared to life. An announcement over the PA following a moment later.
Attention passengers, this service will be departing momentarily. The cafe is now closed. Please, take your seats.
I stepped back inside, just in time to see cafe guy closing up shop and heading downstairs. He gave me a little wave as he left, and I, rather hesitantly, gave a half-hearted wave back to him. I really wasn't sure about this guy, and I think he knew it. Something about his non-answers earlier and had my alarm bells ringing. Chugging back the last of my coffee, I threw the cup in the trash before heading downstairs to grab a seat on the front deck. I noticed my fellow passengers on the way past. All three of them this time. The two from the cafe and the guy from last night, all sitting in the same row of seats. They gave me a little side eye as I walked past. One of them, still chowing down on his sausage roll as he stared at me. A look of apprehension in his eyes. What the hell? Why were they so worried about my presence? Brushing it off, I opened the door to the deck and made my way up to the bow, grabbing a seat in the shade provided by the upper deck. There I sat, my leg nervously bouncing up and down now, as the ferry began to make a move. I wondered where we were headed this time. Norfolk Island? Auckland? Bloody Antarctica? All I could see ahead of me and out both sides was blue. It gave me the feeling of being stranded in another world. In some ways, I suppose I was. The underwater realm beneath me a dark, endless, alien landscape to those of us who dwell above it. I shook my head, not wanting to think about that. The ferry began to pick up speed now, and the winds blew harshly across my face. It was still cold here, despite being in the middle of the summer months. I squinted my eyes and shuffled across a couple of rows where I could be at least a little shielded from the harsh sea breeze. And there I kicked back, and I tried my best to enjoy the ride. For ages we sailed. It must have been at least 3 hours at a guess, before I finally began to catch sight of land. It wasn't long then, before the iconic Sydney skyline started to come back into view, and I felt at least some relief in the knowledge that we were heading in the direction of some form of normality. The vessel slowed its pace as we rounded the bend into Port Jackson, and we began the scenic cruise into Sydney Harbour. Despite the strangeness, I couldn't help but take in the sheer beauty around me. I had lived here for many years, and I had seen these sights a million times, but they still never failed to take my breath away. My home city truly is beautiful. Picture-perfect beaches and stretches of crystal blue waters define the natural landscape, intertwined with lush forest reserves, age-old architecture, and the awe-inspiring cityscape rising up beyond. The smell of the salty harbour air, it gave me something of a sense of calm as we sailed past beautiful Watson's Bay, the Sydney Harbour National Park, Robertson's Point, the Botanical Gardens, and, eventually, rounding the bend into Circular Quay as the harbour bridge and the Opera House came into view. It doesn't matter how many times you've seen it, there's still that same sense of wonder that overcomes you every time you lay eyes on it. I actually managed to crack a smile in that moment, my racing, anxious mind finally slowing to a manageable pace. We were back. I was almost home. Except I wasn't. It probably took me longer than it should have, but eventually it dawned on me. Where the hell was everyone? I got up from my seat and I walked around to the port side of the ferry, looking out over Circular Quay, usually packed with tourists and people going about their day by this hour. Yet, it was eerily empty. I could see random people, just figures, walking between various laneways and side streets in the distance, but nobody walking along the waterfront. The restaurants, normally so busy the lines around the doors, were all closed. Even the opera house was strangely deserted. No tourists posing for photos, no tour groups making their rounds. I wondered if perhaps it was a public holiday or something. But no, I didn't think it was. At least not as far as I knew. That shouldn't account for the total lack of tourists in any case. I continued to pace around the deck, my feet clanging against the metal as I strolled, and I gazed out all over the harbour. There were a few vessels out and about, but even the water traffic was very quiet today. Nowhere near as many boats out there as there usually were. The ferry began to slow its pace even further now, the engine dying down to a low gurgle as we began to swing into Darling Harbour. I glanced out over the oddly still waters as we steadily drifted by the Barangaroo docks, where all this had begun. I was silently praying that perhaps we might stop there. But alas, it was not to be. The ferry did indeed eventually stop, however, right there in the middle of the harbour. The vessel lurched backwards, swinging to the left slightly as it came to an abrupt halt, and I steadied myself on a nearby pole as it did. I shot glances all around, wondering what may be the cause of this sudden emergency stop. As I stood there, I began to get the strangest sensation come over me. It was nothing like the creeping dread that had been building over the last 12 hours. It was a sudden, urgent sensation, screaming at me that I was not safe. I stood frozen, clinging to that pole, staring out over the deck into the deep, murky waters mere feet away. Suddenly, startling me out of my fixation, an announcement over the crackly PA system.
Remain inside the vessel. Attention, remain inside the vessel. For your own safety, do not go near the water. I repeat, stay away from the water.
I leaned back a little upon hearing that. This has got to be a joke, right? An audible ripple on the surface startled me, and I took a step back. The water was otherwise still. What had caused that? Another barely perceptible splash, and the water began to ever so slightly bubble, right there, in that one spot where the ripple had been. I slowly stepped back, fearing that sudden movements might startle something. One step, then another, until finally I could feel the portside doorway. I slowly and quietly slid open the door and stepped backwards inside before sliding it shut again. I turned around and I froze. All three of my fellow passengers were staring at me, eyes wide with fear. Not concern this time. No, stone cold fear. I didn't know what to do. I just stared back at them, gesturing with my hands as if to say, "What?" They all turned away as I did so, looking straight ahead, their backs rigid, their hands in their laps. I didn't know what the hell was going on, but I got the vibe that the expectation was to sit still and be quiet. So I quickly grabbed a seat next to the doorway and I steeled myself. As I sat there in my seat, I heard things. It was barely audible at first, but grew slightly louder with each repetition. A soft, banging sound emanating from below the vessel. It echoed throughout the cabin. I glanced outside, hoping to catch sight of something, anything that might give me a clue as to what was going on. There it was again, louder this time. It was almost as though there was something heavy floating under or around the ship, bashing into it periodically. But here's the troubling part. It was clearly impacting a different area of the ferry each time it happened. Something was down there, intentionally slamming into us. For many long hours, I and my fellow riders sat there, still as statues, as this, whatever it was, slammed itself into the boat over and over. Occasionally, I could feel us tipping backwards or to the side ever so slightly, and I silently prayed that whatever was doing this did not possess the force necessary to tip this floating nightmare into the harbour where it awaited. I wanted off this ferry, but not that way. The hours ticked on by, and as night began to settle in over Sydney, our knocking menace finally left us be. I couldn't be sure, but I could have sworn, as the ferry's engines powered up once again, I saw a clearly defined slipstream catapulting away into the dark waters in front of us. Maybe it was just my imagination, or a trick of the light, but honestly, I don't think so. The ferry began chugging away again, and at this point, I was all but convinced I was still not getting off this thing. It had been almost 24 hours by this point. This time last night, I was still slaving away in the office, and as I thought back to that, I'd have given anything to be back there again. I glanced over at my 3 fellow travellers, still sitting there in that same row of seats. One of them, with his head in his hands now, shaking his head from side to side. I decided to try my luck and just talk to them. I really wasn't sure how approachable they were, so I'd held off until now. But I wanted answers. I got up from my seat and I walked on over to their side of the ship, sitting down one row behind them. I spoke up. I'm just gonna ask, okay? Do any of you have any idea what's going on? They stayed silent, their eyes facing straight ahead, not moving at all. I focused my attention on the one guy who was acting a little differently from the rest. His head still in his hands clearly shaking now. Mate, please. You seem to know full well as I do. This is clearly not normal. Whatever is happening here, it's not normal. Please, I just want to know what's happening. The man lifted his head from his hands and slowly turned around to face me. I could see his eyes were red and wet. He was quite a young man, in stark contrast to the older 2 beside him. He looked like he wanted to say something, but was holding back. Please, man, please. What's going on? Where is this ferry going? He quietly stared for a moment before speaking up. To the end of the line. He spoke these words softly, yet with a tone of finality, before turning back around and facing straight ahead like the rest of his group. With a groaning creak, the ferry took a sharp left, adjusting its heading toward the Parramatta River. I sat there in a state of shock. I tried once again to get the attention of any of these guys, but with no luck. Something about the way he said what he did suggested that this end of the line was not a place I wanted to end up. I got up from the seat and left them be, making my way back to one of the front rows, resting my head against the glass and just watching. A strong wind began to pick up outside, and the ferry began softly swaying from side to side, its metal construction straining and creaking as it drifted slowly down the river. As I watched out my window, I noticed things that just didn't make sense. Things were in their place, kind of. I had sailed down this river many times for work functions and things like that, and everything I was seeing outside was technically where it was meant to be. But what was there was entirely wrong. A mass of tidal trees, right there where they should be, yet very different. Gnarly were their forms, twisted and lanky. Not the beautiful green canopy I was used to, but a looming mess of spindly dead limbs which seemed to reach out for our vessel as it slowly made its way past. A few of them even scraped along the side of the ferry as we went, sending out this awful noise, not unlike nails on a chalkboard. The houses which lined the river, they were different too. Gone were the beautiful brick-constructed riverfront homes which lined the waters. In their place, tall, cage-like constructions, their bars rattling in the fierce winds outside, and the water from the murky river lashing up and over them. As we began to sail closer to them, I began to notice figures inside these cages. People. At least I think they were. They were flailing around from side to side, splashing through the shallow waters of the riverbanks which these enormous cages sunk into. They waved their hands as the boat sailed by. It was as if they were trying to get someone's attention. I quickly turned away from the window when we sailed close enough by them that I got a good look at their faces. They were terrifying, their expressions distorted into scowls, with a burning anger deep in their eyes. I got up from my seat, deciding to once again try to raise someone's attention. I ran up the stairs, making my way to the entrance to the captain's quarters. As I got to the door, I noticed that the internal privacy shield was down, and I could see inside this time. I saw only a man facing straight ahead, much like the other passengers. But this man was not nervous. He stood firm, his composure rock solid. I once again tried knocking on the door, screaming at him to open up, to help me. But his focus did not break. He had one job, it seemed, to drive this ferry, and nothing was going to stop him. Defeated, I wandered back to the rear of the upper deck, taking a seat by the port side windows. I could do nothing but sit and watch as we traversed further and further into the darkness. As we sailed, at some point, I noticed yet another strange figure. Not in the cages this time, no. Just walking along the riverside, navigating around those awful trees as it made its way along. Eventually, it took a turn, walking down to the riverside. I watched as this thing stepped out onto a strange wooden pier, something that looked like it was built in the 50s. And there they stood. I knew what was coming, but I did not want to believe it. My heart skipped a beat as the ferry swung a hard left and began pulling into dock at this rickety old jetty. As we pulled in closer, I could see the person's face more clearly. It was a relatively young man, perhaps mid-30s, and he was shaking. Whether from the cold or out of fear, I did not know. I shuddered as a terrible grinding noise rang out as the ferry scraped against this old jetty. a clang from below, and I looked outside to see a well-built man wheeling a ramp out onto the wooden docks. It was that same guy from last night, the one I had resolved to keep clear of. But where the hell had he been, and where did he just come from? I had not seen him at all since I boarded. Another 2 blasts from the ferry's horn, followed by a stern voice through the PA.
Do not exit the vessel. Do not exit the vessel. Do not exit the vessel.
My heart began racing. This was my chance. I looked down, watching as the young man shuffled his way across the ramp, the ferry bouncing up and down, threatening to dunk it into the water at any moment. I got up from my seat and I started making my way downstairs.
Do not exit the vessel. Do not exit the vessel. Do not exit the vessel.
To hell with that. I picked up my pace, running down the stairs. My only goal, to get the hell off this forsaken boat. I gave no thought to the strangeness outside, to this twisted, otherworldly plane which awaited me. All I knew was that step 1 was getting myself off this thing. I broke into a sprint when I hit the bottom floor, dashing towards the doors when suddenly, smack! I ran straight into the boarding passenger. I stepped back, my flight pointless now, as the ferry began to once again pull away into the night. The man stared at me, his eyes wide and clearly shot with fear. The look in his eyes as he saw me, it was as though he was staring his own death in the face. It was haunting. He grabbed onto my arm suddenly, and I tried to pull away, asking him what the hell he was doing. He simply stared back at me as he gripped me tight and asked, "How are you here?" Before I could get a single word out, he turned and ran upstairs. In shock, I just stood there for a moment, watching as Ramp Guy slammed the contraption back against the wall and stormed off to the back of the ship. Shaking myself back into the moment, I turned and I ran upstairs, following that guy. And I froze. There he stood, right there, just beyond the top of the stairs, in the aisleway. He was just staring. He didn't look scared anymore. No, he scared me. His face, the best I can describe it, is devoid. Devoid of emotion, devoid of expression, devoid of life. He was completely and totally still, staring straight ahead. Not at me, just straight ahead into thin air. I slowly approached the guy, waving my hand in front of his face. No response. I tapped his shoulder, trying to raise any sign of life. Nothing. Very carefully, I tiptoed around to the side of him, trying to get past, keeping my eyes locked on him at all times. I was just about to back away when in that moment, his head snapped toward me.
Are you looking at me?
Jesus Christ! His voice was awful, deep and distorted, and his eyes full of sheer hatred. I stumbled back, almost toppling down the stairs. I grabbed at the rail, trying to keep my composure as I stepped backwards. As I did so, he took measured paces towards me, coming closer and closer. I turned and I ran. Grabbing the sidewall, I pivoted around the corner, making a beeline for the ferry's lavatory. I could hear footsteps, still coming down the stairs, as I ripped open the bathroom door and hurled myself inside, locking the door behind me. And there I stayed, listening to this thing For a human being, I was now convinced it was not. Knocking on the door. All throughout the night. "3 a.m. 4 a.m. 5 a.m. 6 a.m. 7 a.m. Silence. Finally, silence. I had not slept a wink. All hours of the night, I lay there, on the cold, steel bathroom, listening to something knocking on the door. Occasionally, I would hear it speak. Kind of. What passed for its voice floated through the gap beneath the door. Mostly just gurgles and whispers. But every so often, I could make out words.
Too late.
It would say, in between strange slurping sounds.
No, don't let me go.
I could make out, on the tail end of a growl. During the night, in between that infernal knocking, I would hear the ferry making more stops. I noted different sounds and sensations as the ferry traversed into what felt and sounded like the strangest of places. Some sounded quite similar to the rickety wooden pier we had docked at earlier in the night, but others were different. At times, I would hear what sounded like giant, medieval-style drawbridges come crashing down, or the distant clang of an anchor hitting the bottom of the river, followed by scratching noises as though things were clawing their way up the sides of the boat, followed by wet, soft footfalls making their way inside the cabin. At around 4 a.m, I felt an immense impact, and I swear, I heard the sounds of creaking trees and the ferry itself shaking and vibrating, as though it had sailed straight into the tree line beyond the riverbanks. Of course, I had no visual way to confirm this. I could only piece together what I was hearing and feeling. As I'm sure you can appreciate, even when morning broke and I could hear that knocking no longer, I was still quite apprehensive to the thought of exiting my safe haven. I may have even hidden out there for the rest of the day, had it not been for the growls emanating from my own stomach. It then dawned on me. I had not eaten in over 30 hours. It's not that I hadn't noticed, it's that I had quite literally been in a constant state of fight or flight mode pretty much since I boarded. I wouldn't say the fear had worn off by this point. It sure as hell hadn't. But my body was making it very clear that it would be ignored no longer. I had to eat. The sound of boys outside was music to my ears. Not only did it mean that we were back in the harbour, away from that awful river, but I also took solace in those subtle reminders of normality. The idea that the world outside this vessel resembled something of what I once knew it to be. I had to have something to hold on to, anything that may allow the concept of hope to remain strong in my heart. I then heard another familiar sound, the crackle of that damned PA system, and I wondered what horrors the mysterious voice may command onto me today.
May I have your attention, passengers? The cafe service is now open. Please, form an orderly line, and you will be served momentarily.
Thank God, I thought. I could get some food into my stomach. Slowly, I inched the bathroom door open. The thought of that awful thing who had chased me in there last night, ever present in my mind. Thankfully, he was nowhere to be seen as I swung the door open all the way and I stepped back out, making my way up and around the corner to the stairwell. And there I paused. I couldn't see that guy anywhere, but there were others now. Some of them I recognized as my fellow passengers from yesterday, or folks similar to them. Others were very different. They were all just shuffling their way up the stairs to the cafeteria. Maybe 20 people now altogether. It was like this was some kind of ritual that needed to happen, rather than something they wanted to be doing. I gave a bit of a nod as these 3 men I recognized from yesterday limped by me on their way upstairs. But they didn't even look at me. They just stared straight ahead, their jaws slack. They were followed by 2, people, I guess. I say people, but I really was not sure. They looked human enough at first glance, but looking closer, I started to notice strange imperfections in their forms. It was as if they were the result of an AI generator's attempt at a human being. Their legs looked as though they shouldn't be sufficient to support their forms, nor did they move right. They didn't really walk as such. They more stuttered. That's the best I can explain it. Their hands were strange too. Long fingers that seemed to curve into pointed ends. I turned my gaze away and I shook my head, refusing to focus on that anymore. I had more pressing matters, I thought, as my stomach gurgled once again. I went to the back of the line and I started making my way up the stairs, patiently waiting my turn as my travelling companions all collected their orders before shuffling off down the stairs. I caught sight of my buddy, cafe guy. He smiled that same warm smile, going about his routine of preparing coffees and heating up frozen pastries and the like. And before long, it was my turn. His expression once again changed when he saw me, morphing into more of a sarcastic smile, shaking his head a little.
So, how did the night go?
He asked me, a suggestion in his voice that he knew full well it had not been a good night. I paused a moment, letting out a little sigh and shooting back a defeated look in his direction. I'm not getting off this ferry, am I? I asked bluntly. Cafe guy laughed softly as he grabbed a cloth and started wiping down the benches.
It's important to know one's place in this world. I always say, some questions are above both our pay grades.
He answered nonchalantly. But I was not letting him off that easily. Mate, you clearly work here, or wherever here is. You obviously know what's going on. What's with the bullshit? If this is all pointless, you may as well tell me what's happening. I snapped back, my patience running thin. He stopped what he was doing, turning around to face me and leaning over the bench before responding.
You say that as though every question has an answer. You ask as if we are entitled to these answers, even were they to exist. Tell me, where were you headed when you boarded this vessel? Do you know? Do any of us know where we're going at any one time? Or in the grand scheme of things? I should hope not. There would be no mystery to life if that were the case. Then, where would be the excitement? Why do we go to bed with hope in our hearts, if not for the fact that we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, or the next day, I would suggest you keep this in mind, young man.
He didn't speak these words with any hint of malice or anger. He spoke matter-of-factly, but not as if to suggest impatience on his part. He spoke with that same kindness which emanated from that smile of his. A blast or two out of the ferry's horn, and I knew it was time to set sail again. Cafe guy knew it too, giving a couple of taps on the counter, as if to hurry me along.
What would you like, sir? I can't hang around here too long.
That put me off a little, wondering what his hurry was. But with my hunger drowning out any sense of curiosity, I thought I'd best get my order in. Give me 3 of those sausage rolls you gave that other guy, and maybe 2 of those chicken and mayo sandwiches, hey? Yeah, I thought I'd best stock up a bit. He seemed to only come by in the mornings, and not for very long. I then asked him how I might pay for these items, and he simply shook his head.
No payment, sir. Not necessary here.
He handed me the sandwiches, and I tucked them under my arm, grabbing the cooked sausage rolls in my left hand as soon as they dinged out of the microwave. He then also handed me a coffee, and I looked up at him with a questioning look on my face.
You look like you need one,
he said, giving me a wink. I laughed and thanked him before heading back downstairs. I noticed the now half-full cabin of people, all sitting there on the left-hand side of the ferry, all neatly in rows, either staring straight ahead or munching on their food for the day. I paused a little, taking a couple of steps back as I noticed that man from last night. But as I looked closer, he was different now. His face somber, looking down at his feet. I backed away, heading on over to the rear starboard side of the ship and taking a seat against the far wall. I sat my sandwiches down on the seat next to me before ripping into one of the sausage rolls. Oh my God, let me tell you, at that point, they tasted like heaven. With my stomach full and satisfied, I decided to head out on deck and get some fresh air. I shot a glance across the ferry, concerned that these people might try to take this opportunity and rob me of my food reserves. But there they sat, still looking dead ahead or down at their feet. A few of them still shot those weirdly concerned looks in my direction, but they would look away as soon as I made eye contact. I took a second to place my sandwiches on the floor and shoved them under a seat against the wall. There, that should do it. I got up, taking a nice swig from my coffee as I made my way out onto the deck. We were sailing nearby Athol Bay, I noticed, as I made my way around the deck, catching sight of Whiting Beach. I allowed myself a moment to feel relatively okay, delighting in the taste of the fresh coffee, the smell of the salty air, and the beautiful sights and sounds around me. The harbour was alive today. Jet skis and tourist vessels cruised the waters, and the nearby Taronga Zoo was clearly abuzz with people. That had taken a minute to sink in, but it finally clicked. People. In stark contrast to the previous day where I had only been able to catch glimpses of shadows, remnants of a city once alive and vibrant. Today, that life had returned, and I realized in that moment I was less than maybe 2 kilometers from a return to this normal world. I threw my coffee down on the deck and I looked out straight ahead, focusing my attention on Whiting Beach. It was a straight shot, and I was a strong swimmer. I slowly stepped my way to the railings of the vessel, and I leaned over, looking down into the dark depths of Sydney Harbour. Goosebumps ran up my spine, prickling sharply in my neck, as I envisioned how far down the bottom was. I could picture the sea floor in my mind, the coarse sand, the seaweed, the bull sharks with their beady eyes and keen senses waiting for any sign of movement on the surface. No, I couldn't think about that right now. Shark attack statistics tell me that I will most likely be okay. If I stayed on this ferry, there was no such chance of that. I put one foot up on the railing, gripping the top bar tightly as I swung my leg up and over it, the next one following close behind. My hands remained in a vice grip on the rail as I slowly turned myself around to face the water. The ferry was moving quite slowly at this point, and I could see some little critters swimming around down there as the wind blew softly against my face. It was still freezing, and I wondered if the water would be the same. I wondered if my body would shut down, hypothermia taking me before the sharks even had a chance to. Shaking my head and dispelling these thoughts once again, I accepted the dark waters before me as the lesser of two dangers, and I prepared to dive on in, letting go of the railing and leaning forward, when suddenly,
Don't!
I reached back just in time to grab the railing and stop myself from falling. I spun around, darting my eyes in all directions, looking for the source of that noise. And there he was. Cafe guy. No smile on his face this time, but a look of great sadness and genuine concern for me.
Don't do that.
He spoke again, before turning around and walking back inside, disappearing up the staircase within. I spun back around to face the waters and was met with a crushing reality. They were all gone. The vibrant city which had just a moment ago surrounded me, filling me with hope, was gone. The beaches, the waterside walkways, the harbour itself, devoid of life once again. I lowered my head in defeat, genuinely contemplating hurling myself into the water and being done with it, facing whatever eventuality cafe guy had so sternly warned me of. But no, I could not. Whilsoever there was still a chance, I had to hold on. Feeling defeated, I made my way back inside, taking up residence in my row of seats as the ferry began to make its way up and down Sydney Harbour again. Onwards we sailed, and as we made our way back down toward Darling Harbour, the ferry began pulling in and making stops at strange ports once more. These were all stops that I recognised, but as the ferry docked in, it became evident that these were very different places from what I knew them to be. With a clunk, we came to a halt at Circular Quay, a stop where normally hundreds of passengers eagerly awaited ferries heading to various destinations. What I saw there now was little more than a floating platform, more reminiscent of a small oil rig than a modern ferry station. I watched as the big guy tossed out the foot ramp, and more people shuffled their way onto the ferry. I avoided their gaze as they made their way inside, but I could feel their eyes burning into me as they slowly waddled past, joining the rest of the passengers in their rows of seats. This happened over and over. Every stop we made, what I knew to be reality was simply not there. As we pulled into Milson's Point, the dock now blackened and covered in disgusting barnacles, I reluctantly forced myself to look over toward Luna Park. No more was the colourful, welcoming theme park. In place of the Mr. Moonface, a set of huge, barbed wire gates, twisting their way up skyward. Where the big top once stood, something that resembled a giant barn, rotting and decaying. More of these human-resembling figures trudging their way out of its massive gates. Some of them were running towards the ferry, making their way on board. The Ferris wheel? A monstrosity of a contraption. Wiry arms sticking out from a dilapidating, screeching metal center, grinding around in circles. People were clinging onto the ends of these arms, going around and around, screaming as they went. I looked away, wanting to see no more. This was too much. The crushing reality that I had very much ended up in some kind of rupture of space and time, trapped here, perhaps forever, diminishing any sense of hope that remained within me. All day this went on, the ferry slowly continuing to fill up with more and more of these strange depictions of human beings. Usually, they would board the ferry quietly, making their way down to their seats and sitting down. But there was one notable exception to this rule. I would become painfully aware that night that not all who board this vessel are harmless. I had just finished the second of my sandwiches when I realized what was happening. Gradually, the ferry's motions became more violent, the boat rocking back and forth in clearly harsher seas. Yes, we had once again made our way out of the harbour. The tall waves outside began to lash at the sides of the ship as I felt the captain swinging a hard right. I looked out my window. We were sailing south, the land clearly visible out the starboard side. I cringed as we passed by Bondi Beach. Dark, twisted figures flailing around in the waters as fog once again thickened around us and the frigid night air settled in. The ferry drifted on down the coast, shaking from side to side in by far the worst conditions I've ever experienced. The waves were monstrous now, and we weren't even that far out. Every so often, I would shoot a glance out the other side of the ferry to see towering walls of water smashing up against us, water pouring through the windows, drenching the mindless drones in the seats beside them. The ferry was tipping violently from left to right now, so dangerously close to capsizing that I could see the surface of the ocean right outside my window before the vessel would swing back the other way. Yet somehow, we remained topside. I was almost ready to jump up and run to the safety of my bathroom again, when the ferry swung another hard right, coinciding with a massive crack of thunder and a blinding flash of lightning. It was so loud and so bright that I cowered on the floor in terror, uselessly trying to protect myself from being fried to death by a stray bolt from the skies. By the time I pulled myself back up and looked out the window again, all was calm, aside from a very light trickle of rain. No more violent waves, no more rough seas. Everything was quite still and very quiet. I stared out the window, the fog beginning to clear a little, and I noticed where we were. The ferry was sailing into Botany Bay. As the ferry slowed its pace, the engine reducing to a low drone, I saw things out the window that were just impossible. I stumbled up the stairwell, making my way over to the port side and sliding open the door to the upper deck. As we sailed along Prince Charles Parade, I looked up in absolute astonishment. I was staring at the 100-foot mast of a colonial-era British naval vessel, the Union Jack, waving in the cold winds. As the ferry crept its way around this thing, I could see faces peeking curiously over the deck at me, as if I were the out-of-place object in this situation. The sheer size and the awe of this thing made me feel like little more than a mouse. But this was not the strangest thing I would see here. As we sailed slowly further down the coast, I looked out to see men clad in formal military dress of an age gone by, scurrying around the sands, shouting orders and waving their weapons in the air as people dressed in little more than rags trudged their way across the sand, their arms and legs chained. It had of course dawned on me by this point, as unbelievably impossible as it was to accept, I was somehow witnessing firsthand the landing of the First Fleet. Another towering Navy ship up ahead dwarfed our tiny ferry, and feeling dizzy from the sheer enormity of it all, I stumbled my way back inside, slumping down into my chair. I continued to watch out the window as this bizarre historical flashback unfolded before me. A little further down the bay, my stomach churned as I gazed out upon the sickening sight of a group of prisoners on their knees. 2 soldiers standing before them, their weapons trained. I looked away, hiding my eyes and blocking my ears in anticipation of what this meant. I kept my senses as dulled as possible as 5 consecutive shots rang out through the night. I felt tears running through the cracks in my fingers as the reality of what had just happened echoed through my head. The frantic shouts of men snapped my attention back to the surreal happenings outside, and I saw one of them waving to the ferry, signaling it to stop, it would seem. I shuddered at the thought of this. Surely, there was no way we would pull in here after what had just happened. A familiar creak of straining metal proved that hope woefully wrong as the ferry swung around and began slowing as it neared the shoreline. I sunk back into my seat, making myself as small as possible. Slowly and very carefully, I raised my head, peeking out the window as I felt the ferry jerk to one side, its anchor hitting the floor of the bay. There stood Ramp Guy. He gave the anchor a couple of firm tugs before standing up and waving his arms in the air as the men below wheeled a massive ramp of their own up along the shoreline, sliding its top edge over the deck of the ferry. I pulled my head away from the window again as I heard the sounds of chains making their way up the ramp, dragging across the deck, and eventually a series of loud clangs as the chains fell free.
Thank you, officers.
Ramp Guy said menacingly, the first time I'd actually heard him speak. I heard boots stomping back down the ramp and off into the distance, and soon after, the sound of the anchor being reeled back in. I felt almost relieved as the ferry began to pull away from this awful scene. That is, until I heard the sound of footsteps clunking up the stairs towards me. This was out of the ordinary. So far, the passengers had stayed downstairs, all seated on the left side of the ferry. These ones were coming straight up towards me. I turned away, focusing my attention out the window, not wanting to look at who or what was coming up those stairs. In the vague reflection of the window, I noticed figures. Just outlines was all I could see, moving their way through the cabin. They took over 2 rows of seats behind me, a few rows back from me. There were numerous men, 4 or 5 in number, and they did not sound friendly. They spoke in Cockney accents, talking back and forth between themselves regarding their alleged crimes, which I will not repeat here, so heinous in nature they were. I tried to sink lower and lower in my seat, hoping that I would go unnoticed. But alas, after a few minutes of bantering between themselves, their voices became hushed. They began to speak in harsh whispers, ominous in tone, and with clearly sinister intent. Me, the obvious target of these intentions. My mind raced as I heard them stand up from their rows of seats. I looked around for something, anything that I might use as a weapon to defend myself, but I found nothing. I settled in the end for the keys in my pocket. I carefully grabbed them out and firmly wedged one key between my fingers in a tightly clenched fist. I heard footsteps approaching, and I heard the men's hushed voices erupt into a violent shout. I grabbed the back of the seat in front of me, about to get up and bury my makeshift weapon into whatever was standing before me, when all of a sudden, the door to the captain's quarters swung open. I did not look, for what I saw merely out of the peripherals of my vision was enough to dissuade me. Something tall, unnaturally so, stood in that doorway. I sat back down in my seat and I stared straight ahead, refusing to look. My attackers, they stood frozen in place as this figure took heavy steps very slowly towards them before coming to a halt a couple of steps away. I very carefully turned my head slightly and shifted my eyes to the point I could just see what was happening. They were all standing about a foot or so behind me, so I could make out figures, but nothing more. This thing, he, it, whatever, was massive. The head brushed against the ceiling as it stared down at these men, who all cowered in fear before it. Up ahead, the captain stood firm behind the wheel, never wavering, just staring out into the dark seas before us. As I sat there, frozen in my place, I heard the sounds of footsteps, a group of them, tapping their way across the floor to the other side of the ferry. And out the corner of my eye, I saw these 5 men ever so quietly take their seats and stare straight down at their feet. I quickly averted my eyes as massive footfalls began making their way back this way. I heard them stop, right beside me, and I felt something staring right at me. I began to shake where I sat, praying that this would just go away. And it was then a deep, awful voice spoke one word.
Interesting.
Before walking away, the door to the captain's quarters slamming behind it. I broke down at this point, falling out of my chair and collapsing onto the floor. I stared at the ceiling, too exhausted to care about what was happening around me anymore. How in the hell was I here? What in the hell was happening? I curled up right there where I lay, watching out the upper rear doors as the ocean began to show its fury once more. I just stared at the waves outside, mesmerized by their motion, wondering where on earth we were now, until I finally managed to succumb to sleep. I was blasted out of sleep by an unusually loud eruption from the blower. Checking my watch, I saw it was around 2 in the morning. What the hell was going on now? I thought, as I pulled myself together and got up off the floor. I glanced over. The 5 men from earlier were still in their seats, hunched over and sleeping. I rubbed my eyes. What the hell? That didn't sound like the ferry. It was too loud. The sounds from the ocean chop were louder now too, water ripping its way over the surface. Louder now. What the hell is going on? What's doing that? I grabbed the sliding door to the deck and slid it open, stepping outside into the frosty night air. I noticed a bright light as I stepped out, grabbing the railing to steady myself as I made my way up to the front of the upper deck. In one panicked moment, my eyes rose up to meet the sight of the enormous cargo ship carving its way through the ocean straight towards us. There was no time to even think. I ran and I dived off the side of that accursed ferry, smashing head first into the blackness of the Pacific Ocean. I wasted no time as I crashed through the surface. I flailed my arms and kicked my legs as fast as I possibly could, trying to swim down as deep as possible and put as much distance as I could between me and the monstrosity above me. I did not open my eyes, and I tried not to think about the sheer depth of what I was slowly disappearing into. I felt my body almost snap as I was violently pulled into a current of water as this thing flew past above me. I was suddenly enveloped in darkness as its massive form bulldozed over the ocean's surface, and I was tossed around like a rag in a washing machine. It felt like minutes on end before I was finally released, floating helplessly there in the depths. For whatever strength I had left, I pulled myself up towards the surface, the moonlit night thankfully giving me some form of direction. I kicked and swam with all my might until finally I broke through the surface. Immediately, I began looking around for the wreck. I had to find something to grab onto, some rogue piece of broken ferry that I could at least float on, or ideally, a stray life jacket. I looked around, as far as my eyes could see, searching for anything that might do the trick. No. I looked out toward the moonlit horizon. No. I snapped my eyes around to both sides. No. I shot a frantic look around behind me and in all directions. No. There was no wreck. There was no cargo ship. And the ferry was gone. Do you fear the water? I do. Of all the phobias which exist, I imagine this is one of the most common that we all share. I invite you to imagine just how it felt for me in that moment. Picture yourself in a deep, yet relatively safe body of water. Maybe a diving pool. You look down, you see your legs dangling above the bottom of the pool, 16 feet down. Not scared yet? Okay. Now imagine the complex is empty. It's nighttime. You watch as the lights are all switched off, one by one, and suddenly, you are alone. All you can hear is the gentle swish of the water, and perhaps now, there are those subtle thoughts nagging at the back of your mind. Is the bottom still there? Which way is out? What's underneath me? Now, take away the swimming complex. You're not there anymore. No. Now you're floating in a lake. It's not huge. You can see the shoreline, and it's only around 20 feet deep. You know this lake. You swim here often. Yet still, it is nighttime. There's no one else around you. And while the human part of your brain knows that there are no dangers in this lake, those primal fears that still dwell deep within your DNA makeup, they don't know that. What was that splash of water behind you? A small wave? Or something moving? But no. You know this lake. You know that you are safe. Now, imagine you have no such comforts. You are kilometers offshore, floating in the rough seas of the South Pacific. There is over 13,000 feet of dark water beneath you. It is the middle of the night, and you know without a shred of doubt that there are things swimming around underneath you. It is quite impossible to accurately describe the fear that one feels in that situation. So like I said, I invite you to attempt to imagine it. For the first few minutes on end, I was practically hyperventilating. Waves were rising up, smacking me across the face, and I was struggling to tread water and keep myself afloat. Such was my state of panic. I remember the sharp pain in my neck as I snapped my head around every which way, frantically looking for any sign of hope, only to see an endless dark horizon in every direction. I recall the moment that I managed to somewhat calm my panicked mind, the dizziness subsiding, and my breathing returning to something that resembled normal. That, of course, was the moment that the true fear set in. That fight or flight mode, when your blood's up, it tends to keep you distracted enough that you don't really need to focus on the reality of the terrible situation you're in. It was when I calmed down, began breathing steadily, and treading water naturally, that it all hit me at once. I felt so small. Quite literally, a drop in the ocean. I tried so hard to stay focused, but all I could think about as I flailed there in the ocean was how quick and easy it would be for a great white shark to swim by and sink its teeth into my abdomen. I wouldn't even know it was coming. It was so dark, and the sounds of the wind and the waves would drown anything out. I would just be floating there whole 1 minute. Then, I would be a bleeding corpse the next. I thought about how pointless a death that would be. It's weird, I know, but these are the things you think about when you're facing such a reality. Sharks? They don't even really like the taste of humans. I wouldn't even become a satisfying meal for a hungry predator. I would just waste away out there, slowly disintegrating for nothing. And then it happened, shocking me out of my morbid thoughts, as though only to confirm them. A slight tickle on the sole of my foot. I snapped backwards quickly, though I did not look down. I continued treading water, hoping and praying that whatever had just touched me had been a stray piece of seaweed or something harmless like that. I imagined my legs dangling down there. I imagined a mouth opening up as a tiger shark raced up from the depths, ready to close its jaws around my feet. I shook my head, trying to shake those awful thoughts from my mind. And there it was again. Not just a tickle this time. No. I felt something grasp around my ankle. I pushed myself backwards again and took a few backstrokes away from where I was. What the hell was that? Something had just grabbed me. No shark can do that. I was quickly returning now to my panicked state, my primal brain screaming at me to get out of the water. But of course, that was not an option. I told myself I had to keep calm, and I did so the best I could. I forced myself to breathe to a rhythm, and I forced myself to keep treading water slowly, calmly, to not thrash about, to conserve energy. And yet, every few minutes or so, I would feel it again. That feeling of something slippery and slimy, poking, grabbing, and prodding at my feet and legs. For those arduous hours I was out there in the blackness of the ocean, this thing's behavior continued. Every so often, I would just start swimming. I don't know how far I got. The tide was strong, and I could feel currents pulling me back the way I came. But no matter how far I thought I swam, this thing pursued me. At one point, I felt the distinct sensation of some kind of tentacle wrapping around my thigh. I could feel it squeezing tighter, almost to the point that I could not kick that leg any further, and I almost resigned myself to drowning in that moment. I still don't know what it was, and I still don't know why it let go. But that would be the last I felt of it. Minutes later, after what I can only estimate was around 3 hours, floating in the middle of the ocean alone, I heard a sound that I never imagined could bring me such comfort. I spun around, and there it was. Its bright spotlight shining straight on me. I was not ignorant to the fact that I was about to be going from the fire straight back into the frying pan. I was just grateful I was going to be out of the former. The ferry's engine slowed to a crawl as it began spinning around, turning to face the port side of the ship towards me. Up on the deck stood these two pale figures. I must impress. These figures, while humanoid, were clearly not human beings. For one thing, they were naked, yet featureless. Their faces blank slates. I mean, they did have faces. They were just devoid of any emotion or intent. I did wonder for a moment what these things' intentions were. Did they mean me harm? Were they here to finish me off? Were they there to simply taunt me as I continued flailing helplessly in the water until I inevitably drowned? Thankfully, none of these theories were true, as a second later, I watched as they hurled a life ring out to me. The way they moved was absolutely bizarre. Every motion was in perfect parallel unison with each other. Both arms swung out like a perfect mirror image as they threw the flotation device out to me. And then, after I grabbed on, They, once again, in perfect unison, began reeling me in. When I reached the side of the ferry, they continued this bizarre synchronized routine, reaching down and tossing over a rope ladder, which I proceeded to climb up, dragging myself onto the deck of the ferry. Exhausted, I lay there for a few moments, thankful to be out of the water, yet painfully aware I had only prolonged the misery of my foreseeable destiny. After about a minute or so of laying there on the deck, catching my breath, I rolled over, reached out for the railing, and I pulled myself back up to my feet. I stood up to face these things. They stared at me, still standing there, almost a side-by-side reflection of one another. The only difference now is that one did indeed have an expression on its face, and not a pleasant one. It stared at me, with a scowl on its face. I did not feel like I was in any immediate danger from this thing. More than anything, he looked pissed off. I was just about to open my mouth and thank them, when out of nowhere, he slapped me. Seriously, I shit you not. This thing, without a single change in expression, with zero hesitation, lifted its hand and slapped me across the face. I could only stare at this arsehole, a look of absolute bewilderment on my face, as they both turned and walked away. Once again, they swaggered off in perfect sync with each other. I watched them round the corner out to the rear deck, and that was the last I ever saw of them. Jesus, just when I thought this ferry could get no weirder. I lifted a hand to my face, rubbing it slightly. My God, that hurt. I wouldn't have too long to dwell on that though, as in that moment, my eyes were drawn to an almighty crash coming from the ocean behind me. Torrents of water from whatever had been responsible for this disturbance splashed all over me, drenching the deck. I staggered back a little as the ferry itself creaked and groaned as it swung to one side before crashing back down again. I rubbed the salty water from my eyes, my vision blurry, as I heard the ferry's engines roaring back to life. We began to pick up pace now, as I stumbled my way over to the railing, leaning over and glancing out into the ocean. There was no mistaking it this time. There was something massive down there beneath the waves. It moved with purpose, its form drifting from side to side as it floated through the water. Whatever it was, it didn't seem capable of immense speed. It quickly fell behind the more the ferry picked up pace, powering away into the night. I thought of a couple of things in that moment. My first thoughts, of course, being the hours I'd spent floating in that water, with that thing poking and prodding at me. Had it been this giant which was taunting me all that time? And if so, why did it not pull me down into the depths with it? The second thought that crossed my mind were this ferry's seemingly random trips out to sea. Could it be the case that whatever this thing was hunting us? Were these back and forths out to deeper waters not random at all, and simply the captain trying to stay one step ahead of this monster? I did not know. All I knew in that moment was that I was glad I wasn't down there with it. Taking one last glance out to sea and noting the sun just beginning to peek its head over the distant horizon, I slid open the door to the cabin and I stepped on back inside. It did not take long then for the physical exhaustion to catch up with me. Adrenaline had worn off. My fight or flight response could keep my physical limitations from giving out no longer. My legs turned to jelly, and I collapsed right there where I stood. I awoke a few hours later to a gentle hand shaking me. Honestly, I was tempted to just ignore whatever the hell this was and continue sleeping, perhaps forever. Such was the stink of death on me at this point.
Sir, it's almost closing time.
Cafe guy's voice was both a soothing presence and a harrowing reminder that I had once again awoken to yet another day of this nautical nightmare. I slowly sat up, stretching a little and rubbing my eyes before letting out a monstrous yawn. I noticed the ferry was idle once again, and I wondered where we might be. I was about to speak up in response, but I was cut off by the obnoxiously loud PA system.
Attention passengers, we will be making our departure momentarily. The cafe service will close soon. A reminder to all, please remain inside the vessel and seated. If you need to stretch your legs or get some fresh air, please keep well away from the water. I repeat, no matter what you see, stay away from the water.
Right. That was clearly directed at me, I thought. Apparently, I had broken yet another weird rule. What the hell was I meant to do? There was a giant freaking cargo ship about to smash into us. Was I supposed to just stand there and die? Then again, that clearly had been some kind of hallucination. Or was it? I very much felt it, roaring past above me when I was down there.
Sir, I must insist that we move things along.
I glanced up, realizing Cafe Guy was holding out his hand to me. I grabbed hold, and he helped me up off the floor. My clothes were still all damp, and I stunk like a wet dog. "Ah, thanks, mate," I said, as I struggled to find my footing, my body still very weak.
Come on, let's fix you something to eat, eh?
Cafe Guy spoke warmly, smiling that trademark smile of his. He really did have something of a calming effect among all this madness. I followed him over to the cafe counter, and without even asking, he began cooking up a variety of different pastries, fresh sandwiches and salads. I didn't care what he was making for me. I was ravenous enough to eat absolutely anything by this stage. My energy levels, too, were near on non-existent, so my legs could attest to, as I fell backwards into a row of seats. Cafe Guy noticed this, glancing over at me with a somber look of concern on his face. Before long, he finished up what he was doing and packed all his creations into a little bag for me, bringing it over along with a steaming hot cup of coffee. I was grateful for his presence on this otherwise awful ferry. It was nice to know I had a friend, despite everything else.
Here you are, sir,
he said, handing me the food and the coffee. I didn't even wait, grabbing out one of the beef and potato pies and taking a voracious chomp into its hearty goodness. I realized partway through my shameless display that Cafe Guy was staring at me. He wasn't annoyed or anything like that. No. For the first time, he actually looked like he was trying to hold back laughter. "Oh my god. I'm sorry, jeez. Thanks, mate. I appreciate it. It's It's really good, I stammered out, laughing a little myself as I did so, and taking a sip of my coffee in an awkward attempt to bridge myself back into a state of civility. Cafe guy chuckled softly and shook his head a little. But after a moment, that spark of happiness left his face. He suddenly looked somber again, and he just stared for a moment before speaking up.
You really need to be more careful, young man. You're lucky we found you all the way out there. I'm sure you know this by now, but there are more to these waters we sail than meets the eye.
Finishing up my mouthful of pie, I nodded my head in response. Yeah, I sure do. I saw something down there early this morning after they pulled me out of the water. It was huge. I'm pretty sure whatever it was had been trying to grab me when I was in the ocean too, I said, turning to face him now. Cafe guy slowly shook his head before looking me right in the eyes as he spoke again.
If one of those wanted to take you, you'd be gone.
I froze upon hearing those words. So many things running through my brain all at once. There was more than one? What were they? What was their purpose? And if it wanted to take me? Is that the only reason I'm still breathing? Because this thing was in a good mood? The weight I felt in that moment was crushing. Thinking back to my helpless self, floating in that water. I shuddered just to think of it. The cafe guy noticed this, and he placed a hand gently on my shoulder. He spoke once more in that calming tone of his.
Oh, don't you dwell on it, sir. Things have a way of working out in the end,
he said, before taking a glance down at his watch. He stood up, walking back over to the cafe and crouching down. He pulled out a set of keys from his pocket, opening up a small locker beneath the counter. He pulled out a neatly packed bag, before locking back up, standing up and walking back over to me.
I just have a feeling you need these more than me,
he said, looking down at my still damp clothes.
They're clean and freshly washed. They should fit you. No need to give them back. I shan't be needing them.
I looked back at him, smiling a little myself now. Thanks, mate. I appreciate you. I mean, I still don't know what your deal is here. But you've been kind to me, and if by some miracle I make it back to the real world, I won't forget it, I said to him, before reaching out my hand to shake his. He accepted my gesture, firmly shaking my hand, before turning and walking away. So there I was again, just me and the ferry, and the ever-increasing number of strange passengers boarding it. I had given up hope of even trying to get off this thing. If what I experienced in the sea, and what I had seen outside, was any indication of what the world outside had become, it seemed I was safer in here than I was out there. For now, though, I just wanted to get comfortable. Placing my bag of food down on my row of seats, I took the clothes cafe guy had given me, and I made my way downstairs to the bathroom to get changed. As I stepped down off that final step, I scanned the lower level of the ferry, noticing that both sides had now almost filled up. There must have been some more stops in the time that I was floating out there. Looking around the crowd, I noticed that some of the passengers we were picking up were looking less and less human. In the beginning, when I had first noticed this shift in appearance, it was subtle. Like I said, the kind of human-like appearance that you get from an AI generator. But now, this was even more pronounced. Some of the figures seated in the back right-hand rows had these thick, rubbery-looking heads sporting blank, almost faceless expressions as they turned their gaze toward me. Others were very unnaturally tall and thin, looking like they had been placed between two giant vice clamps and forcibly stretched out. Then, some among the crowd had almost no human appearance whatsoever. Humanoid in shape, being as close as they got. Many of them seemed to have been pulled straight from the sea, just as I was. Their bodies covered in seaweed, with clams and barnacles still hanging off soggy flaps of skin. I quickly looked away from these humanoid nothing people, as I had come to refer to them, as I noticed almost all of them were staring at me now. They were making me feel uneasy, and I did not like it. The fact that they just sat there and stared was in some ways worse than if they'd been doing anything outright malicious. I slipped my way past the back row of seats, shivering as my arm brushed against the scraggly mess of dank, wet hair belonging to one of these passengers. I quickened my pace, rounding the corner and shutting myself inside the bathroom to change. Opening up the bag, I found a set of blue jeans and a white polo shirt. Very casual, I thought. Thanks, cafe guy. I quickly got myself changed into the dry clothes, stepped out, and chucked my now surely ruined set into the trash. I sighed as I glanced out over the deck. We were back in Sydney Harbour once again, a sight I once cherished every time I laid eyes on it. But now, a landscape of pure dread. There was no one out there now. I don't mean like the first couple of times where I could at least see shadows of people in the distance. This time, there was just no one. I woefully turned my gaze away from this depressing landscape, and I made my way back upstairs to my row of seats. The upper floor, it was now my one and only safe haven, away from the nothing people. Even the group of convicts that had tried to attack me last night had now made their way down the stairs to join the rest of them, neatly sat in rows, all facing straight ahead, aside from their dopey stares toward me whenever I would show myself. It seemed the only time they ever broke from this weird trance was to herd themselves up the stairs and get their morning meals. Sitting down in my little corner, I grabbed out a sandwich and started munching away as the ferry made its way up and down the harbour once again. I wasn't even all that shocked anymore as I looked out at the rotting scenery around me. Once again, same as yesterday, the ferry started pulling into various ports and, again, they looked absolutely nothing like I'd once known them to. The Maritime Museum Wharf, which proudly houses the HMAS Vampire, now featured only the decaying hull of a ship half sunken into the harbour. As we began to sail out of the harbour and back toward the Parramatta River, I dared not look as we passed by Goat Island, seeing enough merely out of the corners of my vision to deter me from directly looking at whatever these horrors were that were stomping their way across the shores. Whatever they were massive. I shifted away from the window and into one of the centre rows of seats, afraid that they might reach out for me. Onwards we sailed, up and down the river and around and about the harbour, continuing this now monotonous routine of pulling into random stops. Some I didn't even know existed, and picking up more travellers. I stayed put right where I was, but every time a new group of them would board, my eyes remained locked on the stairwell ahead of me, silently praying that none of them would make their way up here again. It must have been nearing about 4 p.m. that day when it happened. I was out on deck, getting some fresh air, just watching out over the water ahead, when I noticed the ferry was picking up speed. It was moving unusually fast, and this frightened me, but not near as much as what came next. I gripped the rail tight as the ferry began to turn, our heading now directed straight into the bank of the river. I thought this must be a mistake. I was sure that at any moment we would adjust our course back out into open space. But we didn't. We only picked up speed. We were about 20 meters from the shoreline now, and I was about to jump off the side again when I remembered the words from earlier.
Please keep well away from the water. No matter what you see, stay away from the water.
That's right. I remember. Now, mere moments away from smashing into the shoreline, I grabbed the railing as tight as I possibly could, bracing for the oncoming impact. And then suddenly, my grip loosened as my eyes met the impossible sight ahead of me. With an unearthly groan, the land itself began to morph before my very eyes. Within seconds, a new passage of water had opened up, a mass of twisted mangroves forming a tunnel around it. At speed, we blasted through the opening as a crash of thunder erupted from the sky, much like when we had entered Botany Bay, and I cringed in terror, once again fearing I may be struck down by lightning. But then, all was quiet, and the ferry began to slow its pace. As I rose back up to my feet, I looked around in astonishment at the surroundings we now found ourselves within. We were trekking through a mangrove-ridden swampland. The buzz of mosquitoes and the stink of the muddy riverbank thick in the air. I was well travelled around Oz, and there was only one other place in the country that I'd witnessed this kind of scenery. A soft clunk against the hull of the ferry, and the swish of a thick, reptilian tail disappearing beneath the water confirmed what I was thinking. We were not in Sydney anymore. We were traversing through a northern mangrove river. My head began to spin. I'm not sure why. Surely I should be used to this madness by now. But somehow, this damn ferry managed to up the stakes yet again. I stumbled backwards, turning around to go back inside, when I was met with the sight of yet another crocodile. This one, its head slightly elevated out of the water, as they tend to do before they jump, its jaws open slightly. I kept my eyes locked on it, ready to throw myself backwards should it make a move, but not wanting to be the one to move first and startle it into striking. The ferry gurgled along through this murky hellscape as the world around me became progressively weirder. Dark mist was now rising up out of the water, and more creatures began swimming around, circling the vessel. The more I got a good look at them, the more I realized how wrong I had been. They were not crocodiles. too big. Even the most monstrous of crocs ever seen in Australia capped out at around 8.5 meters. These things circling the boat were at least twice that, looking more like the ancient Sarcosuchus than a modern-day crocodilian. I took another couple of steps back, and suddenly, the PA system once again crackled to life.
Attention. For your own safety, remain inside the ferry. Stay away from the water, and do not look outside.
They didn't need to tell me twice. I quickly, yet quietly, made my way back inside and took my seat again. This time, keeping my eyes front. For hours, we sailed through this natural maze until I finally felt the ferry begin to swing into a stop. Once again, the PA system exploded with static.
Attention. Remain inside the vessel. Keep your eyes closed. I repeat, keep your eyes closed.
Catching sight of the long, twisted jetty winding out from within the dark mangroves ahead, and the barest glimpse of the tall, stretched out nothing people lined up along it, I did exactly what the PA voice instructed. I squeezed my eyes shut tightly and did everything I could to turn my focus away from what was outside. A screeching sound rang out as the ferry swung into dock, followed by the regular clangs out on deck as ramp guy hurled the now busted up metal footbridge out onto the pier for these awful things to board the ship. I could hear quiet whispers, along with the soft buzz of insects and the lapping of the water against the shoreline. I then heard the tapping of what sounded like sharp, pointed feet clicking their way across the ramp. And finally, I heard the sound of the ramp being pulled back in and the gates latching shut. The ferry then floated there for a few minutes as I listened to the new arrivals getting seated downstairs, their whispers now fading away as they no doubt joined the rest of the mindless drones in their ever-present state of nothingness. Once I could hear them no more, and was satisfied that they were of no threat to me, I opened my eyes. Please don't be real, I thought, as I immediately shut my eyes once again. Something was looking straight at me. Through the window, right next to my head. The window was only half closed, leaving no barrier between us. I dared not continue to look, for what I saw was enough. It was clung to the windowsill, its face half pressed against the glass. The rest of its body hung limp across the deck of the ferry, its legs dangling over the side. I squeezed my eyes shut as tightly as I could as I felt its breath on my neck, and I heard it whispering between breaths.
Can you help me?
It said, between ragged breaths. I slid myself over to the farthest seat in the row I was in, but even then, I could still feel its breath, and I could now feel its hand sliding up against me, as if it were desperately trying to grab onto me.
Please help me.
It spoke again. I once again felt a slimy hand uselessly attempting to grasp at my arm. I was crying silent tears now. I wanted to get up and run, but I did not know what else was around me. Perhaps I would be running straight into another of its kind.
Help me.
It spoke just one more time, as the ferry began to pull away from the jetty, and I heard it slide off the deck and plop into the water. Not once more did I open my eyes as the ferry continued sailing through this otherworldly land. Every so often, I would hear the ferry pick up pace, followed by that familiar crash of thunder again, before slowing down and continuing to make more stops. All the while, I could hear things boarding the vessel. Some would speak in tongues I could not possibly understand. Others spoke in languages I recognized but did not know. Spanish, Mandarin, a variety of Asian and European languages, as well as many others. I would hear the odd American or British accent, and in amongst it all, I would also hear terrifying voices, mixtures of groans, clicks and gurgles. All manner of specimens were being herded onto this ferry. But for what? I had no idea. Nor did I really want to know anything about what was happening around me. It wasn't until we were back in Sydney Harbour that I opened my eyes again. And how I wish I had not. The ferry picked up pace, roaring through yet another of these portal things. And once we were through, I heard the familiar sounds of the harbour once more, and I felt comfortable enough to look outside. First glance was not enough. I had to be certain of what I was seeing. I closed my eyes, shook my head, and looked again. As the ferry slowly sailed down the harbour, a terrible sight lay before me. Sydney was no more. I mean, it was there, kind of. The beautiful cityscape I had gazed upon so many times was now an apocalyptic wasteland. The Sydney Tower, once standing proudly high above the city, had been snapped off midway up. The buildings were in ruins. The Sydney Harbour Bridge lay in shambles, broken off in the centre, with each side hanging downwards. I watched in horror as hordes of these nothing people wandered across the decaying bridge from both ends, toppling into the harbour as they reached the tipping point in the centre. The Opera House, once a proud symbol of our beautiful city, now lay in pieces, its iconic sails scattered all over. I turned away from this nightmare, forcing my eyes to look at anything else. But what I saw inside was no better. The ferry was almost full now. Many more nothing people had entered the vessel during our ventures down that river and wherever the hell else we had been. All over the world, by the sounds of things. The upper floor, it was no longer my safe haven away from them, as it too was now almost full. The entirety of the opposite side now filled up with figures taking all manner of forms. All of them staring squarely at me. I looked away from them, feeling uneasy, yet relatively assured that if the previous days were any indication, once they were boarded and seated, they meant me no harm. The ferry continued to sail up and down the harbour, and a few more stops and pickups were made. All the while, I tried my best to relax, to sit back, and to not draw any attention to myself. And I managed to do just that, even as my own side of the ferry began to fill up with boarding travellers, I somehow managed to keep my head. That is, until the end of the day. It was around 7 p.m. that night when the ferry went down. No, I don't mean it powered down for the night. I mean, it dropped straight down. Any composure I had managed to maintain went out the window as I tucked myself down in my seat, preparing for the rush of cold water to pour in through the open doors and windows, trapping us all in this underwater coffin. But that did not happen. I was instead suddenly surrounded by utter silence, save for a dull wind. I slowly raised my head and opened my eyes, noticing the pitch black night sky outside. Had I imagined what had just happened? I could have sworn to God this ferry had just dropped straight down under the water. I saw it. I felt it happen. But alas, there was the night sky, right there. I could not hear the typical sounds of the harbour anymore, and I did wonder if we were still in Sydney. I got up from my seat, intending to take a look around outside, see what I could see. Slowly, I slid open the door to the starboard side deck, and I very carefully stepped out, painfully aware of the many hidden threats that may lie waiting out there. What met my eyes this time, however, was so much worse than anything else that I had seen on this journey so far. As I gazed out over the side of that ferry, seeing no water at all beneath us, and observing the green and blue ball suspended in vast, black nothingness, slowly disappearing into the darkness that we were now floating off into, I realized with a dizzying horror. Not only were we not in Sydney Harbour anymore, we were not even on Earth anymore. Standing out on the deck, as the ferry drifted through an infinite expanse of stars, was by far the most out-of-body I have ever felt. I could not comprehend how this was happening. I shouldn't have even been alive out there. Yet somehow, I was able to breathe and move just as I normally would. Whether this was by some magical confines of the ever-mysterious vessel, or some universal spell I was under, I still don't know. I slowly paced around the deck, taking in the awe-inspiring views around me. Making my way around to the upper front deck, I looked out to the port side of the ferry, and I had to steady myself. I saw a massive, glowing white ball. It appeared to be so close to us that I could have jumped off and floated right to it. It took me a few moments to realize it. I was staring at our moon. I was dumbstruck. It was so close, right there. I turned back around, gazing out over the starboard side, and I noticed that Earth was directly in my line of sight now. I looked back around. There was the moon, off to my left. Looking back again, there's Earth, off to my right. Something happened to me in that moment. This was entirely wrong. My mind, it simply could not compute the orientation. The moon should be above me. Earth should be below my feet. It also dawned on me in that moment. I was seeing Earth off to my right, where it was below me earlier. We must have been slowly spinning around as we drifted through the galaxy. Again, I could not mentally process this. I began to feel incredibly dizzy, and I fell to the ground, unable to pick myself back up. I had to crawl my way back inside, sliding open the door and dragging myself to one of the only remaining empty rows of seats. The rest of them, all occupied by the nothing people. Sitting back in my seat now, I just looked out the window, watching the celestial light show outside. If I wasn't already, I was pretty damn sure now that I was not ever getting off this boat. Ever. I felt a sense of peace in that moment, like I didn't have to try so hard anymore. There was a feeling of acceptance, followed by a mix of sadness and regret. I thought back to that night. What if I had just taken a cab instead? It was midnight. What on earth was I even thinking taking a ferry back home at that hour anyway? Money. Of course. It was always about money. Not in this moment, it wasn't. All of that seemed quite unimportant now. I just watched as literal space and time passed by before my eyes. Before long, my eyes became heavy, and I could keep them open no longer.
Attention passengers, the cafe service is now open. Please form a line. Do not rush. Do not push. Everybody will be served in due time.
The announcement from the PA system ripped me out of my slumber, signaling the return of my one and only friendly companion. I watched as the masses of nothing people and strange humanoids began their march towards the cafe. The ferry was almost full now, and there was a constant stream of them, shuffling and stuttering their way up the stairs. One by one, they placed their orders, collecting cups of coffee, hot pies, fresh sandwiches and slices of cake, before slowly making their way back down and filling up the empty seats once again. I decided I was going to wait until things calmed down a bit. I didn't want to go anywhere near these things. The tall, pointy-limbed ones which had boarded the ferry in the mangrove swamp yesterday, they were now clicking their way up the stairs, and I cringed back a little as they emerged at the top, their faces coming into view for the first time. They were downright horrible. Long, puffy faces that seemed permanently crafted into vicious looks of sheer hatred. I looked away, resigning myself to just waiting until I heard the crowds disperse. I could hear cafe guys struggling to keep up with all this, and yet his overtly positive attitude never once faltered. He still hummed Kumbaya as he went about his duties, and I now smiled at the sound of that tune, where it once kind of weirded me out. If he could keep his spirits up, maybe I could too. I sat back, waiting my turn. Slowly but surely, in amongst the noises I cannot even accurately put into words, I heard the crowd beginning to thin, and I chanced to look back in the direction of the cafe. There were only about 5 or 6 passengers now, waiting in line to be served. At the front of the line stood a short little thing, no taller than a child of maybe 5 or 6 years old. His form was scrawny, save for his gigantic head, and looking at it, I wondered how he actually stayed upright. It looked as though he should be toppling over every step. While this thing resembled a child in stature, it clearly was not. His face looked something more akin to a 60-year-old man, a thick, gruff beard and wrinkled skin. I watched as he raised his arms, jumping up and down at the counter like a toddler would, before one of the taller passengers behind him reached down and picked him up, sitting him on top of the counter. I had to blink and shake my head a couple of times to make sure what I was seeing was actually happening. It didn't matter how much I'd been exposed to. The sheer absurdity of this ferry, it still managed to catch me off guard. I watched on as he placed his order in a language I could not fathom, before sliding off the top of the counter and landing back on the floor with a thud. He caught sight of me staring as he spun back around to await his order, and as he did so, a frown emerged across his face. A second later, he took a step forward, raised his hand, and flipped me off. "Are you kidding me?" I thought to myself, as he turned back around and stared up at Cafe Guy, tapping his foot as if growing impatient. Cafe Guy noticed this, and he stepped away from the coffee machine for a moment. What happened next was rather chilling. I did not hear what was said between these two, but what I observed was enough. Cafe Guy slowly stepped out from behind the counter, kneeled down to get face to face with this little guy, and whispered in his ear. As he communicated whatever it was, the little guy's face grew more and more somber, as though realizing he had made a terrible mistake. Just before he stood up, Cafe Guy pointed towards the captain's quarters, before turning back and whispering a few more words of caution to him. And that was it. Cafe Guy stood up once again. And the little guy stood off to the side now, his hands tucked behind his back, waiting patiently and quietly for his order. Once his food was prepared, he grabbed it from Cafe Guy, turned around and looked at me sheepishly. He gave a little wave, as if to say, "Sorry about before," and then waddled off downstairs. I could only stare after him, left to wonder what Cafe Guy had told him. Although, it wasn't hard to piece together the gist of it. Whatever that thing is that had stepped out from the captain's quarters the other night, it's not something I'd like to be drawing the attention of. Pushing those thoughts to one side, and noticing that the remainder of customers had received their orders and were now making their way back to their seats, I got up and made my way over. I was feeling hungry for a bite to eat, but also, I was keen to pick this guy's brain a bit more.
"Good morning, my friend,"
said Cafe Guy as I approached the counter. I gave him a little wave and returned his greeting before stepping up to lean on the counter. "I guess there's no point in asking you where we are, or how we're here," I asked Cafe Guy, assuming he was going to simply dance around the point once again. But then, what he actually said surprised me.
"We're on our final run. We'll be home soon. You can relax now. The journey is almost over,"
he said, and something in his happy, optimistic tone had me almost believing those words. Deep in the back of my mind, though, I knew that wasn't true. But hope is a strange thing. It just takes the tiniest spark to keep you believing, to keep you holding on. Well, whatever that means, I guess I won't be seeing any more of you after, well, whatever comes next, I asked him as he stood there smiling.
Oh, I'll be around, young man. I've worked this route for many, many years, and I'll be doing this for many more to come. Like I always say, it's important to know one's place,
he said, his smile wavering ever so slightly. I stared back at him, a look on my face struggling to mask the millions of questions I still wanted to ask, yet knew to be pointless. I got the feeling that no matter what I said, how I phrased it, or how desperately I begged him for answers, he wasn't going to give me any. Whether by choice or perhaps he genuinely did not know, I'm still not sure. Anyway, satisfied that I had once again hit the threshold of what he was willing to offer, I turned my attention to my empty belly, asking him for a couple more of those sausage rolls that seemed a staple of his little cafeteria. Cafe guy smiled warmly, turning around and pulling a selection of sausage rolls out of the freezer box and throwing them into the microwave.
Coming right up, sir,
he said, before turning around to prepare me a coffee. What a great bloke, I thought. I never even had to ask him. What's more, he seemed to show the same kindness and accommodation to all the critters on this vessel, regardless of size, shape, language, or outward appearance. Cafe guy was a man of the people. Or rather, of the nothing people. The microwave then dinged. My precious pastries were done. I grabbed them from Cafe Guy with a smile and a thank you, along with my hot coffee for the day. I bid him farewell once again, returning to my seat to get my breakfast into me. Sitting in my row of seats up front, I munched away on my sausage rolls and sipped my coffee as I gazed out the window, the universe slowly passing us by. Regardless of how I got here, or what came next, I was very aware that I was witnessing something very few human beings would ever have the privilege to see. I watched as a meteorite, its tail burning so brightly in the darkness, flew past in the distance, and I wondered how far away it really was. 1 Earth length? 5 Earth lengths? That blew my mind just thinking about it. Peeking my head out the window a little and looking up, I saw a group of tiny planets, or perhaps moons, just suspended there, as if props being held up by string before a huge, black canvas dotted with sparkles and swirls. As the ferry drifted through this sheer magic, I swear I could hear whispers all around me. Not inside the ferry, no. Emanating and echoing all throughout the galaxy, it seemed. They were indistinguishable from one another, yet beautifully unique at the same time. As insane as that sounds, all I can say is that things seem to work differently out there. The laws of our world, they did not apply anymore. For example, my mind would occasionally catch a stray thought, reminding me that there was no up or down out here, and I would suddenly feel weightless. I would have to lay down every time it happened, stretching out across my row of seats. Still, when I think about that, I get that same feeling of vertigo. In that moment, however, before everything that happened next, I can honestly say that it is the most alive I have ever felt. I continued watching the stars, distant planets, and all manner of cosmic happenings for hours on end as the ferry continued gently floating along. Eventually, I do not know when. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. My eyes began to close, and I felt this sense of peace, unlike any I've ever felt before, and likely ever will again. With an overwhelming warmth washing over my entire being, I was pulled into a blissful slumber once more. Jeez, I thought I was done hearing that god-awful noise. I took a peek down at my watch, noting the time was around 10 p.m. at night. Gosh, I had slept for hours. Sitting up from my little row of seats and stretching, I took another look out the window, noticing that we had drifted our way into a very different looking sector of the galaxy. I say galaxy, as this is my best estimate. I had no idea if we were even still in the Milky Way, or if we had drifted far beyond the rim. What I saw outside at that point, in comparison to where we had just come from, the best word I can use is desolate. This part of space, it was quite empty, and the colours were very different. Where before, I could see all manner of bright colours and shades, now there appeared to be a dull, blue haze encompassing the area. It was sparsely populated with small, grey-looking planets and moons. The ferry then began to shake and vibrate as we made a slow approach towards one of these planets. I noticed how strange and different this felt. The ferry didn't even turn or readjust itself in any way. It just started drifting diagonally, shaking more violently the closer it got, as if caught in some kind of gravitational pull. As we got closer to the planet, I watched on as Ramp Guy stomped his way around the deck, grabbing the ramp and throwing it towards the gate in preparation. Slowly, we were pulled in nearer to this strange place, which now looked more like a small moon than a planet, its surface rocky and smooth. Before long, a loud clunk, and the ferry groaned as it positioned itself up against a very strange-looking jetty. It looked to be crafted out of black obsidian, and it stretched out for kilometers on end. I noticed a few more odd figures making their way up the dock, preparing to board the ferry. Anything remotely humanoid about the things we were picking up was far gone by this point. These ones walked on all fours, and they moved in pairs. When they reached the top, I heard Ramp Guy shouting at them to hurry up and get on board. I averted my eyes as I heard them clomping their way up the stairs towards the upper floor. What passed for their hands and feet, slopping along the floor before squirming their way into an empty row of seats. The ferry was fast filling up now, with only 4 rows on my side still empty. We continued floating along, making stops at more of these galactic wastelands, picking up more of these beings along the way. At one of these stops, I kid you not, we docked in to collect a group of 3 tall figures. They looked almost identical to the typical depiction of an alien, like the ones you see in movies and TV shows. Tall, slim, pale white and seemingly faceless. They gently swayed their way onto the ship, shuffling up the stairs and taking a seat directly behind me. I could see their forms, towering above me, out of the periphery of my vision. I could hear the strange noises they made as they sat there, no doubt staring at me. Without another thought, I quickly stood up and I practically ran out onto the deck. I couldn't handle it anymore. These things were too close to me now, and I could feel the burn of 1,000 eyes on me. For some reason, I was still quite the spectacle on this ferry. That moment was perhaps the most critical decision I made throughout my entire time on board. For as I made my way around to the front of the deck, I noticed something up ahead. It was only quite small up in the distance at that stage, but I had my inklings as to what it was. Something up ahead was much darker than the rest of the void surrounding us. I was staring at something, pure, pitched black in color, and circular in shape. I knew what it was deep down. I knew, in my heart, that's where we were headed. I ran back inside the ferry, bursting through the door, every set of eyes in the room drawn immediately to me. But I did not care. I ran to the captain's quarters and I pounded on the door. "Please!" I shouted, trying desperately to get his attention. I bashed on the door, over and over and over again, screaming at him to please listen to me. "Please! Please let me off this ferry!" I shouted, slamming my fist against the glass so hard I thought it might break. This time, I did get the captain's attention. Slowly, ever so slowly, he turned around to face me, without ever taking his hands off the wheel. He stared at me for moments on end, his face a blank slate, totally emotionless. I saw in that moment that it was pointless. The way this man looked at me, a look of complete and utter indifference towards me, as though I was merely cattle being herded towards the slaughter, was absolutely soul-crushing. I gently tapped my fist against the glass once more, my head now coming down to rest beside my hand, and I sobbed. I sobbed because I knew it was over. I sobbed as I faced the prospect of half a life cut meaninglessly short. I sobbed as I looked up again, noticing the black ball on the horizon growing larger still. I sobbed as I turned around, my back resting against the door as I slid down to the floor. And I sobbed harder still as I looked up to see Cafe Guy standing there, his eyes wet with tears, same as mine. Forcing myself up, I approached his counter for what I was sure would be the last time. "Why?" was all I could ask. Cafe Guy just shook his head in response, wiping some tears away as he did so.
It shouldn't be possible,
he said between sobs.
I knew there was something different about you the first day I saw you. Your eyes, too vibrant. Your spirit, too lively. You were not ready for this journey.
I stared back at him, things beginning to slowly fall into place. Tears welled up in my eyes as I spoke again, gently now, any remnants of hope long gone. I still don't understand, I said. If it's not possible, then how can it be? Why me? I asked, tears pouring from my eyes. Cafe Guy looked at me solemnly, a deep and genuine sadness present on his once kind face. Wiping away his own tears, he spoke softly to me,
There are very few hard and fast rules at play in this universe. Certainly, fewer than we would like to believe. Sure, we have built ourselves a comfortable little modern society under the false pretense that we are ever truly in control of any of it. Overly confident in the knowledge that nothing which exists outside of our realms of understanding can ever really harm us. It shouldn't have been possible, young man. But you boarded the wrong ferry at the wrong time. Now, there's nothing any of us can do about it but continue on to our final destination.
I stood there in shock, not wanting to believe the words I was hearing, yet knowing full well within my heart that it was true. Cafe guy placed a gentle hand on my shoulder.
I'm so sorry, sir.
Defeated, I once again walked out on deck. I just paced around out there, not knowing what I could even do next, resigning myself to just making the most of the moments I had left. Around and around I strolled, looking out into the vacuum which enveloped us. Occasionally, I would look out ahead at the ever-expanding size of the monster we were approaching. I had heard talk of black holes in my life, but I never really understood the many theories surrounding them. I wondered what we might face on the other side. Would we freeze, or perhaps burn to death? A little of both? Were we to be transported to some incredible afterlife? Or perhaps the opposite? Or would it all turn black as midnight? Our shared existence, blinking out in an instant. Hang on a second, I thought. Midnight.
You boarded the wrong ferry at the wrong time.
What ran through my mind in that instant was perhaps extreme. Yet, is not hope so often a mere grain, worth taking a leap of faith for? My heart began to race, those primal instincts telling me to turn and run, or stand and fight, kicking in once again. I glanced at my watch. 11:45 p.m. It would need to be timed perfectly, I thought, as I ran back inside and took a seat in my now one empty row. Every other seat on the vessel, now occupied by nothing people and shadowy, alien life forms. I sat on the edge of my seat, my leg bouncing nervously up and down as I glanced back and forth between the stairwell and my watch. As I sat there, waiting for my one moment of hope to approach, I heard the crackle of that PA system spark back to life.
Attention passengers, the final cafe service is now open. Last meal requests shall now be taken. Please form an orderly line, and requests shall be catered to the best of our ability.
Hearing those words, last meal, was harrowing, but I steeled myself, intent to remain focused at all costs, no matter what else might happen around me. I glanced back at my watch. The minutes were ticking by so very slowly now. I only prayed this thing was still in sync, or that time was even relevant out here. I did not know. What I did know is that this was a chance, and that was the best I could hope for. The herds of nothing people were all making their way up to the counter, what seemed like hundreds of them now, blocking the stairwell. I watched in amazement as cafe guy churned out beautiful meals, seemingly from nowhere. Everything from fine Italian cuisine to hearty noodle dishes, as well as odd-looking slops, grains, and other dishes that were not even remotely comprehensible to my human brain. Before long, the line had moved up and around the aisles, enough that I had some space to slip down the stairs. Before I did so, I quickly made my way over to the side of the counter, placing a hand on Cafe Guy's shoulder. He looked over to me, puzzled. "Thanks, mate, for everything," I said to him, before darting off down the stairs. There was a look in his eyes as I left him there. He looked concerned, like he knew what I had planned, and he was just as unsure as me as to whether or not it might work. Stepping down out of the stairwell, I grabbed myself a seat right on the edge of one of the center rows with a straight shot to the portside exit. I sat there, nervously bouncing my leg up and down again, my adrenaline starting to kick in. I glanced at my watch. 11:57 p.m. This is it, I thought, as I glanced back up to look at the doorway. And I froze. Ramp Guy, with his massive form and his hate-filled glare, was standing there, staring right at me. Oh my God, did he know? I stood up from my seat, pacing back and forth up and down the aisles, pretending to be simply stretching my legs. Every time I turned around to pace back down the aisle, I saw him, still standing there blocking the doorway. I looked back at my watch. 11:58 p.m. I spun around, walking back up the stairwell now. I could practically feel the ticking of my watch. Every precious second, not one that I could afford to waste. Reaching the top step, I turned the corner, heading toward the portside deck on the upper floor. On my way past, I caught sight once more of Cafe Guy. I think he knew now, and he gave me that trademark warm smile and a little nod as I passed him by. I slid open the doorway, stepping out onto the upper deck and leaning over the railing. Ramp Guy was still there, standing in the doorway downstairs. 11:59 p.m. It was now or never. I stepped up onto the railing of the upper deck, and I jumped. I landed gut first on the lower deck, my sense of orientation completely out of whack with the ferry's weird movements through space. This did not go unnoticed by Ramp Guy, nor did my almost perfectly executed series of movements following it, as I threw myself back onto my feet and ripped open the ferry's portside gates. There I stood, teetering on the edge, staring down into the void as Ramp Guy began moving towards me. 30 seconds to go. I gripped onto the railing so hard it hurt my hands as I shuffled my feet along the narrow, slippery ledge on the outside of the vessel. Clinging to the ferry, I took a few measured steps along the outside, trying to make it as difficult as possible for this prick to grab me. 15 seconds to go. 10 seconds to go. I counted the seconds down in my head now, as I desperately tried to cling onto the railing until the last possible second. 10, 9, 8. Ramp Guy was right there in front of me now. 7, 6, 5.
Where do you think you're going, eh?
He grunted as he gripped my arms tight. 4, 3, 2, 1. I pushed off as hard as I could, launching myself willingly into the abyss. Ramp Guy, however, did not let go. So determined to keep me on board that hellish vessel he was, that he was now plummeting through space right along with me. As we fell, the cold solar winds whipping by us as we went, I cried out in pain as he wrapped a massive arm around my neck, seemingly intent on at least killing me if he could not keep me prisoner any longer. Down and down we fell, ramp guy, squeezing the life out of me harder and harder all the while. I could feel myself slipping away into darkness, and for a few awful moments, I was all but certain that after everything, this was going to be how it ended for me. Then suddenly, a familiar crash of thunder. I was underwater again. Where? I did not know. I tried desperately to kick my legs and get myself back to the surface, but I could not move. I opened up my eyes, and in one horrifying moment, I saw why. A long dead, rotting corpse was clung to my body. I screamed, bubbles escaping my mouth as I manically tried to get this thing off me. Finally, after much thrashing and kicking, I was free, and I kicked my legs and flailed my arms as hard as I could, making my way up towards the sliver of moonlight I could see above. With a crash, I broke through the surface, desperately taking in air as I looked around, trying to figure out where the hell I had been teleported to this time. And then I saw it. It took a few moments to take it all in, admittedly. The familiar cityscape beyond the harbour lights. The iconic Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Opera House still standing firm and intact. Luna Park, bright and bubbly, just as it had always been. I was back in Sydney. The real Sydney.
Oi! Get out of the water, you dickhead! There's sharks in there!
As if to confirm what I was seeing, in maybe the most Aussie way possible, a shout from the shoreline, from a real human being. I never thought in a million years I would be so glad to be bobbing up and down in the middle of Sydney Harbour at midnight. The man did raise a good point though, and I began quickly making a beeline for the rocky edges of the harbour nearby. One stroke, then another, then another. All the while, quite conscious that a bull shark may see fit to take a chunk out of me as I swam along. But I kept on going, knowing that freedom was just a few meters away now. That feeling of grabbing onto those rocks and dragging myself up onto the grass is the best sensation that I have ever experienced in my life. I remember the blades of grass digging into my skin as I stared up at the starry, moonlit sky with a newfound sense of dread. And I recall how overwhelmingly grateful I was for merely being able to feel something as mundane as grass. I was back. I was home. I did not even consider getting on another ferry, or a bus, or a train, too paranoid that something may spirit me away to another realm. I walked myself up the hill, found the nearest road, and called myself an Uber, like I damn well should have done in the first place. A little over an hour later, and finally, I was stepping in through my front door for the first time in what had genuinely felt like months, but in reality, had been merely a few days. There has been much I have reflected on in the days since I returned. Not least of all, Cafe Guy's words. There are indeed very few rules keeping this existence of ours bound to normality, fewer than any of us would be comfortable being truly aware of. I am no stranger to this corner of the internet, that which houses endless creepypasta tales and reality-bending horror stories. So the next time you're reading one of these submissions, perhaps something about a cursed bus or a haunted tram ride, consider for a moment, how far-fetched are these stories, really? It has been long theorized among those familiar with the paranormal that there are certain times of day and night which align with things we simply do not understand. And there are, of course, places in this world where odd things are simply more prone to occur. Maybe you'll remember my tale the next time you're waiting in line for the bus or the train or the ferry. Perhaps the stop you're waiting at feels a little off, a little too liminal, almost like a place between places. Maybe you notice something doesn't quite fit, like an out-of-place fog. Maybe, in those moments, it's best to just call yourself a cab. I don't know. All I know is that what I experienced on board was definitely not of this world. It terrifies me to think what might have happened if I had remained on board, if I had not chanced that leap of faith at the exact second that I did. Who knows where I'd be? And who knows how many more of these vessels are still out there?